I'm Rebecca Harper.
And I'm David Holloway.
Thanks for joining us. This is Fishing for Trouble from ISMS.online.
May 2023. A critical software vulnerability in the MoveIt managed file transfer service triggers a wave of cyber attacks and data breaches. By June of that year, everyone from the government of Nova Scotia to the BBC, British Airways, Boots, Aer Lingus, Ernst & Young, Transport for London, even the US Department of Energy is affected.
August 2025 and Jaguar Land Rover is hit. Just a day after discovery, production is halted for 5 weeks. And as a result, overall UK car production fell by 27%, the worst September for the industry since 1952. Even the Bank of England highlights the cyber attack as an influence on the country's slow GDP growth.
And March 2026, the cooperative group announces that its chief exec is stepping down after a 2025 cyber incident led to not only a £35 million underlying operating loss, but a reputational impact that will take some time to recover from.
The truth is, even if your systems are strong, a weak supplier can shut you down.
And both regulators and investors are now demanding stronger supplier governance.
In an interconnected economy, responsibilities for supplier security and third-party mandate breaches are shifting. And in this episode, we'll explore how businesses can move beyond surface-level due diligence and build truly resilient supply chains. When Jaguar Land Rover halted production, the shockwaves rippled through its supply chain.
With the co-op, it was internal system disruption and operational breakdown, not just direct hacking of its core assets, that caused cascading business damage.
Moving away from the UK for a moment, whilst the name Shiny Hunters might put you in the mind of the latest dance act pulling in the streams on Spotify, for one of the Netherlands' prominent telecommunications providers, there wasn't much to sing about at the beginning of 2026.
Dutch company Odido was hit by cybercriminals who initially released around 1 million customer records, containing thousands of unique email addresses.
But worse was to come because the attackers, thought to be the Shiny Hunters group, threatened that they would release even more data if their extortion demands weren't met. And true to the warning, the following day saw another 1 million items confirmed.
All in all, it's thought the breach may have affected over 6 million customers, encompassing email addresses and, in some cases, bank account details, date of birth, passport and driving license data.
To be fair, Odido published an official security disclosure notice on its website acknowledging the breach and advising customers on potential exposure, and reported the incident correctly.
But how did it happen in the first place? Well, the hackers sent phishing emails to members of Odido's customer service team, asking them for their login details.
Next, the attackers called other employees pretending to be from the IT department and asked them to approve their fraudulent login attempts.
It's thought that the hackers then gained access to a third-party CRM, customer relationship management system, scraping millions of customer records.
To continue that story, let's introduce Madeleine van der Hout, a senior analyst in cybersecurity and risk at Forrester.
She's particularly focused on the European regulation that affects the industry and works with businesses to enhance their security capabilities.
So what happened with Odido, and how did a humble CRM system unleash chaos for its customers in the Netherlands?
If we peel off the onion of this breach, there was so much data that the customer service manager had access to. And they were warned about settings in that CRM system that were per default or that were to a certain extent, and that you as a company, you use that CRM system, but you're also responsible for which controls are actually deployed. and not the provider, not the third-party provider from that CRM system. And there we see that those critical third-party services or products that we use that contain that much data, we should protect that as it's our critical infrastructure. But there also lays that question, responsibility, who owns what? Well, you own your security and you own your security risk.
It's worth remembering that, as our State of Information Security report showed, it's not just the disruption a breach like this can cause. It's the company's reputation and profitability that's equally at risk.
Of the 61% of organisations impacted by a third-party security incident in the past year, 35% suffered damage to financial trust, 33% experienced operational disruption, and 36% saw customer trust and churn having their impact.
And that was the case with Odido.
I think it was like 25% or something, maybe it was higher, of all switching activity from providers in the weeks after the Odido breach. We saw that consumers, because of what had happened, changed their provider or are now expecting at the end of their contract to change provider. So that means that now slowly we see a change that customers are actually very much valuing the security of their data and taking that into account in who they want to have a telecommunication contract or a phone contract with, or maybe in other services as well, that we will see that occur.
So it's clear there are security considerations to be made and gaps to be looked at. So where does Madeline think we should start looking?
I sometimes see that organizations build self-reported questionnaires. Suppliers answers questions about their own security posture with obvious incentive to present well. But then we do not have like a great understanding of what we're actually working with or looking at. I think operational dependency as well. So frameworks usually focus on data protection, cyber hygiene, but we also have to ask those harder questions, right? The operational questions. If this supplier is unavailable for 24, 72 hours, what will stop working in our business? So really making that security risk assessment, but also your operational dependencies. You should treat that as a separate exercise.
With new regulation putting the onus on the business that's buying in the services and the software, there's an increased need to concentrate on concentration risk.
Concentration risk is something that comes up in every conversation currently. I think that topic didn't have the same pressure that it has now, especially that under certain regulations such as the Digital Operational Resilience Act, we see that you need to understand your concentration risk. But if multiple business units independently use the same supplier without anyone at the center tracking the total exposure, what if that organization then fails? And you're so reliant on them and your business is so reliant on them. And I think one of the other things, and that is not in my coverage area, but what I actually believe that we really have to look into is contracts, contract management. And what kind of clauses do you have there? And how do you make sure that everything is well embedded in your third-party risk management? While using third-party risk management platforms as well to help you understand your third-party risk management in the organization.
We'll return to our conversation with Madeline shortly, but I wanted to bring in Kieran Martin at this point. You might have heard from Kieran in a previous episode, and this won't be the last that you hear from him in the series either. Kieran is currently a professor at the University of Oxford and chairs the Cyber Monitoring Centre's Technical Committee, and of course is ex-GCHQ's National Cyber Security Centre, or NCSC.
As a result, he's the man with a whole list of real-life examples of when cyber chains go wrong.
One of the most difficult cases I dealt with as head of the NCSC was in 2019 when a Belgian company that none of us had ever heard of called Eurofins got hacked. Why did that matter? Well, it turns out that it accounted for 63% of the criminal forensics testing capabilities of police forces in England and Wales. So for 6 weeks, they had to cut back on criminal forensics and testing, and they had to prioritise only the most serious crimes. So it was a good time to be a drunk driver, for example, in England and Wales. So you had all these supply chain consequences popping up all over the place, and supply chains have become a bit more complicated. So that's one of the biggest changes, has been the exploitation, or even if not that targeted exploitation, just the consequences of attacks on one organisation having huge ramifications on another.
So both Kieran and Madeline have highlighted how the cost of a supply chain breach can be more than simply financial, sometimes with surprising consequences.
The Jaguar Land Rover incident mentioned earlier was another case in point.
Doing the work on Jaguar Land Rover for the Cyber Monitoring Committee was very revealing in this respect. So if you look at the composition of the roughly 2 billion, 1.9 billion figure for loss with Jaguar Land Rover, just over half of that was direct loss to the company from a combination of mostly lost revenue from not being able to sell cars. Of course, some of that was offset by not having the cost of making them in the first place, but mostly it was the lost income. And of course, there were recovery costs and repairing the IT and all of that. Then, as we all know, because there's a lot of media and political commentary about it, there was severe pressure on the supply chain, with at one point an estimated 30,000 jobs being at risk. Thankfully, that didn't come to pass, but suppliers and partners of JLR were losing money. But then there was another bit of the equation which, we couldn't estimate with any great confidence, but you use standard economic tools like the multiplier. So what's happening to the cafe outside the factory in the West Midlands where nobody's going anymore because the workers are at home rather than coming in for the shift and going to the cafe at lunchtime or whatever it is, the shops in the nearby area, etc., etc. So I think it's very, very important to understand.
So how well are the risks facing supply chains understood by authorities and business? Kieran thinks the bigger world picture has helped all of us understand the dangers of a chain, cyber or not.
I think governmental and wider society's understanding of the complexity of supply chains is growing. The question is, what do you do about it? I mean, why is it growing? It's not so much to do with cyber, it's probably the experience of COVID and the other huge shocks we've had with 2 energy shocks and so forth. And also, odd incidents such as fires at substations near Heathrow closing the airport and so forth. I also remember a fire in Glasgow once taking out ATMs because there was an exchange near where the fire took place, etc. So I remember once at the NCSC, we were trying to do what we would call a mapping exercise of critical infrastructure dependencies, but it just gets too complicated. It gets, almost eternal. So I think what is key is for organizations and to some extent government to understand the bits that really, really matter. Those, what you might call sort of hidden digital streets of Hormuz, those little bits of internet backbone infrastructure that we all depend on, those little bits of hard infrastructure that we depend on, and work out how to diversify the risk. I mean, a very simple example from the US 10 years ago, it turned out that many of the household names on the internet were using Dyn, DYN, an important but not very famous company, as their sole DNS provider. And when it got taken down via an IoT-based attack on CCTV cameras of all things, Amazon, Twitter as was, CNN, a bunch of other household names all went offline in most of the east coast of the US and Western Europe. No serious Titan company has a single DNS provider anymore.
Kieran makes a good point that it can be tough identifying exactly what needs to be looked for and where in the chain.
I think one of the better things the UK government has done in recent years is require that any public contract for more than £50,000 is awarded to a company that has gone through the Cyber Essentials programme. I think that sort of thing is a good use of the government's purchasing power, but I think it's a difficult problem. I think it speaks to the fact that actually outside critical infrastructure and for the small number of privately owned companies that provide critical services and outside personal data protection, there aren't really any obligations on organizations to do cybersecurity properly in company law and so forth. So it's very difficult to find a supplier. How do you even know? Well, I mean, you can ask lots of questions, but there's no framework, there's no recognized metric where you can say, well, this supplier is good at cybersecurity and this isn't. So that's, I think, a problem in the ecosystem that's worth paying attention to.
Back to Madeline now, because Kieran highlighted just one of the requirements that the UK government has put in place to reduce risks and breaches. But I'm sure for many, it feels like there's constant new legislation and regulation to integrate. I'm pleased to say that Madeline remains positive about the growing list of rules.
Back in the day, we had horses. We wanted a faster horse. They came up with a car. But in the beginning, we didn't have crossroads. We didn't have traffic lights. We didn't have any rules. And that meant we needed guardrails. That worked out. It was okay. And I feel that, and you can see this in language as well. So every time there is a new cyber regulation, we approach it negatively. Even the wording, we approach a lot negatively. And then the EU AI Act came up and we spoke about possibilities because it's a different technology and this and that. So I think it's also in how we approach these type of regulations. Cybersecurity regulations are here to help us have a minimal baseline of what is needed to make sure that we're secured. And for me, it's only logical that there is continuous improvement, and especially to ICT risk frameworks and especially to third-party risk, that is ongoing. We work with more suppliers than we ever have done, and probably it will increase as well. So we need to treat that as such.
That's a pretty refreshing take on regulation, an acceptance that as the technology develops, so does the need to keep up to speed.
So where's the starting point in a plan that pulls third-party compliance firmly into consideration?
First of all, I think an organization that has everything set up well really knows throughout the organization what security means for their organization. So the security department has aligned their security strategy with what that means to achieve their business goals. In that, they do great risk assessments. So security is part of the broader company or enterprise risk. And in evaluating that risk, you take into account your supply chain. They have great mapping of their assets. They understand their threat landscape and what is most applicable to them and what is most likely to happen. I think it's a combination of all of that.
What's Kieran's advice?
Firstly, it's about identifying the risk and working out which suppliers you're most dependent on. It's about having a plan that assumes their total failure. And then it's working out what leverage you have to mitigate the chances of that failure materializing. Every time you ask a question about cyber risk, ask about the whole pool in which you swim rather than just your own body, your own organization. Because if something's not right in a wider part, it could have a big knock-on impact on you.
And maybe the final bit of wisdom from Madeline, who takes a similar water-based approach. She thinks you should approach cyber resilience in your business as you would in a boat, being fully prepared before an unceremonious dunking.
I used to sail, I did competitive sailing. And every time we would capsize, if you capsize during a race, you need to have muscle memory. You need to understand how you turn that boat upside down again as quickly as possible, but also make sure you don't injure, make sure that you don't break anything so that you can go forward again. I think that's the same as well with these type of disruptions. What does that mean? But also after disruption, understanding, okay, I'm so dependent on a certain vendor or certain scenario. What does that mean towards the future or to future disruption? So having that continuous improvement into the organization is crucial. I wouldn't even say it's important. No, it's crucial. You have to do continuous improvement. So I like to compare it with that, but it also shows that it has so many layers. It's testing, it's taking into account where are my assets, what are my most important assets, Now, geopolitical asset mapping is also part of the equation because we're very aware of geopolitics, the regulatory perspective as well. So it's many layers.
So I think that's been really interesting, getting those two perspectives, one from a more regulatory viewpoint and one from more of a day-to-day client management viewpoint. And there are lots of big takeaways for businesses from this episode. What stands out to you in particular?
I think it's that you still own the risk even when it sits elsewhere. So
That's
it's still your
yeah.
customer, it's still your data, it's still your network that this is sitting in. So regardless of who owns the tech or the software or the organization that you're working with, you are still responsible.
It's quite interesting to think about it in that sense. I think often people will think about internal risk and external risk. But actually what we're really saying is it's all connected. You shouldn't really think about it in that sense, that you should think about it in how you basically have to continuously manage these risks across a connected chain, if you like.
And it is difficult because you are still responsible, even though you might not understand or know exactly how it's being managed with the supplier that you're working with. You may have certain assurances from them that they're doing things, but you don't know exactly, you're not in those systems, you don't have access. So it is a tricky one for an organization to balance. But I think just knowing who it is that's in your supply chain, who you're working with, and setting your expectations with them is a really strong start. And that's something that came across quite clearly in the conversation.
I think that's right. That always makes me think that even when you do a supplier assessment, that viewpoint is correct on the day that you did it. The compliance exists in the day that it happened. What about post onboarding, or what about sort of operationalizing that relationship? How are you set up to deal with something if it happens? We sometimes talk about it here. Compliance proves you were secure yesterday, but resilience proves you can handle tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
Which is what we're really talking about. So it goes back to what we've already spoken about in this series. You can't treat any of this as a point in time exercise.
Do you know when they've onboarded a new customer their side or a new supplier, or do you know when they've done an update? Are they keeping you in the loop? Do you know if things have changed on their side? That flow of information between you and your suppliers is so integral to both of you being able to keep your organization secure.
Which comes down to that visibility point, right?
Exactly.
So you might think, oh, well, we did our security checks, we've done everything we needed to do, and then we can forget about that. But like you say, what's changing on their side? So having visibility of who your suppliers are, what are your contractual obligations, both ways, and the expectations that you've set, that's going to be a key part of managing that risk. And again, in series 1 of the podcast, we talked a lot about how supply chain is always your biggest risk that you bear. So often we see these breaches and these incidents being caused by a link in the chain. We've talked about some of those bigger, higher profile ones in this episode.
And I think that's why assurance does need to go beyond these checkbox. It does need to be continuous. It does need to be part of an ongoing process, and it needs to be part of an ongoing dialogue internally and externally with your suppliers, because you're only as secure as the information that you have available to you. So checkbox just doesn't work in that environment.
That's exactly it. That concept of checkbox, if you like, that's not going to help you manage that risk. And it's interesting, this concept of planning for total failure. What would happen if this supplier went down tomorrow, or ceased to be available tomorrow? What impact does that have on us as a business? And that's moving, I think, away from an incident response approach to this. So we only think about it when something happens. We would both say resilience is about planning for that before it happens, right? So you're ready should it happen. Hopefully
it doesn't.
Exactly. Hopefully it never will. But it's about being ready, not kind of trying to work it out on the fly, should the worst happen.
And that's resilience, right? Something goes wrong, but you are still able to keep operating, you're still up to serve your customers, you're still able to deliver the service or products that you are contractually obliged to, whilst also being able to respond and recover to an incident. It's not an easy thing to do. So plan for total failure. You're going to be in the best possible position should something happen.
Exactly
to
right.
keep the boat afloat.
To go back to that.
Go back to the water.
Indeed. And it's one of the fundamentals of 27001, supplier management, being able to evaluate the critical nature of a supplier, What services do they perform for us? Who do we contact in the event of, needing to speak to someone there? What is it they do? All of these sorts of things that you should be able to have access to. But if you don't have that set up already today, then you can still start by going, right, well, okay, of all the suppliers that we work with, and of course every business has suppliers that they work with and rely on, which ones are the most critical? What do they provide to us? What would we do in the event of that service or that piece of software not being available to us? And that could be anything from something really critical, a CRM system, financial system, all those sorts of things, right down to other bits of tech, how do you keep your website running or whatever it might be. But just being able to understand, what have we got that we actually rely on to keep our business operating?
Yeah, and that's the whole message, right? Compliance is resilience. And we've touched on this in other episodes. It isn't just thinking in silos as well. You've got to bring all of those areas together. You've got to have your privacy, your infosec, your AI governance. You've got to have it all together, because if one of them goes down, it has implications for the other. So if you're operating in a resilient approach to compliance, again, you're in a stronger place should something go wrong, because you know where all the interdependencies are, both internally and externally. So it puts you in a much stronger position.
That's it. Another example of the resilience leap concept in action.
Yeah.
You can find more resources on building a reliable and compliant supply chain on our website at ISMS.online.
And hopefully this episode has inspired you to interrogate your supply chain and processes.
There are so many learnings over the past couple of decades that are, at worst, an instructive story of when things go wrong, and at best have inspired improvements in regulation and working practices.
Armed with the thoughts of our guests today, it may well be that fewer things need to be mended in retrospect, but are preempted and avoided before they even happen.
If this episode sparked ideas, whether that's improving compliance with the existing legislation, asking some searching questions of your current supply chain, or ensuring the right questions are asked with new partners, then share it with someone in your team.
Because your business is better protected by spotting the supply chain risks on the road ahead than seeing the repercussions in the rearview mirror. For your company, for your customers, and sometimes even for the wider economy.
Next time, why organizations struggle to turn security policy into real-world behavior.
And spoiler alert, it's about making the regulation directly relevant to the employer's day-to-day experience.
See you then.